Most people believe they are free because no one is ordering them around. But the deepest chains do not come from outside. They live in habit, in fear, in the hunger for approval. And the most dangerous prison is the one the self mistakes for choice. In this episode, Iqbal exposes the illusion of freedom. Khudi does not awaken by doing whatever it wants, but by governing itself. True freedom begins when impulse stops ruling, fear stops vetoing, and conscience becomes authority. Today, we continue our journey through Allama Iqbal, The Secret of the Self, the philosophical masterpiece of Allama Iqbal. This is episode 19. Take a moment of stillness and reflect deeply on freedom, obedience, and inner sovereignty. Freedom is often misunderstood. Many believe freedom means doing what one wants. But doing what one wants is often obedience to impulse. True freedom is not impulse. It is mastery over impulse. The self is rarely imprisoned externally. Most chains are invisible. They do not bind the body. They govern the mind. The most powerful chains are the ones the self does not see. Seen chains provoke rebellion. Unseen chains invite obedience. The self obeys silently and mistakes it for choice. Habit disguises itself as nature. Fear disguises itself as prudence. Dependence disguises itself as loyalty. Approval disguises itself as belonging. These disguises construe prisons without walls. The self believes it is free because no one commands it. But freedom is not absence of command. Freedom is authorship of command. Who decides? Impulse or intention? Fear or conscience? Approval or truth? The self that has not examined its inner world has already surrendered freedom. Unexamined desire rules. Unexamined fear vetoes action. Unexamined habit dictates routine. Inner freedom begins with recognition. Recognition hurts. It exposes dependency. Dependency resists exposure. But exposure dissolves illusion. Illusion eats freedom. The self must identify what it obeys unconsciously. Approval, comfort, validation, predictability, security. Whatever the self obeys unquestioningly, owns it. Many lives are quiet negotiations with fear. Fear sets conditions. If you do this, you may be rejected. If you act, you may fail. If you differ, you may stand alone. The self agrees. Agreement becomes identity. Inner freedom is not rebellion against the world. It is separation from unconscious compliance. The self stops asking, "What will they think?" and begins asking, "What does this require of me?" The question shift changes destiny. The self learns. That dependence weakens judgment. Judgment outsourced cannot mature. Mature judgment creates autonomous action. Autonomous action stabilizes dignity. Approval addiction is subtle. It does not feel like slavery. It feels like connection. But approval demanded becomes control. Control quietly erodes character. The self becomes fragmented. When identity depends on external reaction, reaction fluctuates. Identity collapses. Inner freedom restores coherence. By internalizing authority, freedom demands the courage to disappoint. Disappoint expectations. Disrupt patterns. Refuse familiar roles. Courage is costly, but dependence is more expensive. Dependence costs identity. The self must recognize that comfort is not neutral. Comfort anesthetizes tension. Tension produces growth. Chronic comfort produces compliance. Compliance erodes will. The self that avoids discomfort avoids truth. Truth is rarely convenient. Convenience rarely produces truth. Inner freedom chooses truth. Over ease, habits can enslave as effectively as chains. Not because habits exist, but because they exist unconsciously. Habit without awareness. Own behavior. Behavior without ownership shapes destiny silently. The self becomes free when it reclaims authorship over habit. Not erasing habit, but choosing it. Chosen habit becomes discipline. Unchosen habit becomes imprisonment. Fear does not need to dominate. It only needs to be unquestioned. Questioning fear weakens it. Obeying fear strengthens it. Fear trained becomes caution. Fear untrained becomes tyranny. Inner freedom allows fear to advise, not rule. Advisors inform. Rulers command. The self decides who holds authority. The self often mistakes rebellion for freedom. Rebellion reacts. Freedom chooses. Choice anchored in conscience produces responsibility. Responsibility affirms freedom. Freedom without responsibility becomes chaos. Chaos invites control. True freedom stabilizes order internally. So external order is unnecessary. The self recognizes that certainty is seductive. Certainty promises safety, but certainty immobilizes growth. Freedom tolerates uncertainty. Tolerance expands range of action. Inner freedom allows the self to stand still without panic. Silence without distraction. Solitude without escape. Presence without performance. Such stillness reveals sovereignty. Many believe freedom requires power. but power acquired without freedom enslaves. Conversely, freedom without power atrophies. Inner freedom builds power responsibly. The self-empowered internally cannot be easily manipulated. Manipulation feeds on fear and dependence. Freedom starves manipulation. Inner freedom dismantles victim thinking. Victimhood externalizes control. Freedom internalizes response. Events do not define the self. Response does. The self no longer waits to be saved. Waiting breeds passivity. Freedom acts. Action reinforces authorship. The self becomes aware that obedience unchosen is submission. Submission slowly destroys self-respect. Self-respect is freedom externalized. Where self-respect stands, freedom breathes. The self must reclaim the right to say no. No to distraction. No to manipulation. No to false obligation. No to conformity without conscience. Each no clarifies identity. Inner freedom is costly. It costs comfort. It costs popularity. It costs familiarity. But it purchases alignment. Alignment outlives everything else. Freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself. It shows in decisions made when no one is watching. Those decisions shape destiny. The self that gains inner freedom feels lighter, not because burden vanished, but because burden was chosen consciously. Chosen burden dignifies effort. Unchosen burden humiliates it. Freedom restores self-trust. Self-trust restores courage. Courage stabilizes action. Action manifests Khudi. Inner freedom requires confrontation. Not with the world, but with the self's learned obedience. Obedience that was never chosen, only absorbed. The self learns early what earns approval and what invites rejection. These lessons sink below awareness. Later, the self calls them personality. But much of personality is conditioned adaptation. Inner freedom begins when conditioning is questioned. The self must ask, why do I do what I do? If the answer is fear, freedom is absent. If the answer is habit never examined, freedom is delayed. If the answer is truth deliberately chosen, freedom is alive. Many live efficiently, but not freely. Efficiency can coexist with slavery. One can optimize routines and still avoid critical choice. Free lives are not optimized. They are owned. Inner freedom disrupts convenience. It interrupts automatic patterns. Automation saves energy, but costs awareness. Awareness is the currency of freedom. The self that wants to be free must slow down enough to notice its own obedience. Speed hides submission. Urgency silences reflection. Freedom reclaims time. The self is often afraid of inner silence, because silence unmasks. In silence, excuses dissolve, justifications weaken, choice stands naked. Naked choice is frightening, but it is the birthplace of dignity. Freedom is not choosing between options. Options are often pre-selected. Freedom is choosing the frame in which options appear. Frame choice is authorship. Authorship creates selfhood, the self that allows others to define success. Will never be free. Definitions inherited without examination become invisible prisons. The self must redefine success internally. Internal standards protect autonomy. Inner freedom demands the courage to stand misunderstood. Misunderstanding is the price of independence. Dependence avoids misunderstanding at the cost of self-respect. The trade is subtle but decisive. The self that fears rejection trades truth for acceptance. Acceptance gained this way is never secure. Security premised on silence invites internal conflict. Conflict drains vitality. Freedom dismantles this conflict by choosing alignment. Alignment may isolate temporarily, but isolation endured consciously strengthens coherence. Coherence stabilizes presence. The self that chooses inner freedom must accept responsibility for its outcomes. Blame evaporates. No one remains to accuse. Freedom includes accountability. Accountability sharpens maturity. The self becomes careful about commitments. Unchosen commitments enslave. Chosen commitments liberate. Freedom is not endless choice. It is precise choice. The self reclaims freedom by limiting itself consciously. Limits chosen internally expand freedom externally. Limits imposed externally shrink it internally. Self-imposed discipline is freedom refined. The self sees that impulse is not freedom. Impulse is reaction. Reaction is predictable. Predictable behavior can be controlled. Freedom requires unpredictability, grounded in conscience. Inner freedom resists propaganda. Not political slogans alone, but emotional manipulation. Fear-based narratives. Scarcity-based urgency. Tribal outrage. Freedom asks for evidence. Emotion without examination invites domination. The self that is free internally does not require constant stimulation. Stimulation distracts. Distracted selves are steerable. A calm self resists steering. Inner freedom restores discernment. Discernment filters input. Filtered input preserves clarity. Clarity enables deliberate action. Deliberate action shapes destiny. The self becomes harder to coerce. Coercion depends on leverage. Freedom removes leverage. What cannot be threatened cannot be controlled. The self learns that conformity is often cowardice. It hides behind numbers. Freedom demands individuality. Individuality requires courage. Courage stabilizes Khudi, the self that breaks inner chains. Feels disoriented initially. Chains provided structure. Freedom demands self-structure. Self-structure is responsibility. Responsibility matures the soul. The self must learn to tolerate discomfort without immediate relief. Relief addiction enslaves. Endurance liberates. Liberated selves expand options. Freedom accepts uncertainty. Certainty guarantees obedience. Uncertainty invites choice. Choice strengthens identity. Inner freedom dismantles comparison. Comparison is hierarchy imposed. Hierarchy dictates worth. Freedom rejects assigned worth. Worth becomes internal measure. The self that internalizes worth stops begging for validation. Begging erodes dignity. Dignity stabilizes presence. Presence amplifies impact. The self with inner freedom is difficult to offend. Offense requires ego fragility. Freedom hardens identity. Through clarity, not armor. Inner freedom also reshapes desire. Desire trained serves growth. Desire untrained enslaves. Freedom trains desire. By subordinating it to purpose, the self learns to distinguish between needs and cravings. Needs strengthen survival. Cravings weaken autonomy. Clarity dissolves compulsion. Freedom builds patience. Impatience seeks escape. Escape avoids responsibility. Freedom stays present. Presence grants control over response. The self becomes internally calm. External chaos loses influence. Influence without control cannot dominate. Inner freedom stabilizes equilibrium. The self no longer waits for permission. Permission seeking indicates dependency. Freedom acts within conscience. Conscience replaces authority. The self integrates solitude. Isolation no longer terrifies. Solitude nourishes reflection. Reflection protects freedom. The self becomes capable of resisting the crowd without aggression. Aggression reacts. Freedom remains centered. Centered selves do not shout. They stand. There comes a moment when the self recognizes that freedom was never external. No change in circumstance could have granted it. Freedom had to be claimed internally, or it would never arrive at all. The self understands that many struggles were not against fate, but against invisible obedience. Obedience to fear. Obedience to approval. Obedience to habit. These loyalties went unquestioned. For years. Questioning them changes everything. Freedom introduces loneliness at first. Not because connection disappears, but because alignment becomes non-negotiable. False attachments fall away. Remaining connections deepen. Depth replaces quantity. The self no longer measures life by applause. Applause is unstable. Silence becomes tolerable. Tolerable silence becomes strength. Strength reshapes presence. The free self is not reckless. It is deliberate. It chooses its commitments carefully. It understands that yes without conscience creates invisible cages. No spoken early preserves direction. Inner freedom permits disagreement without hostility. Hostility arises from insecurity. Security anchored inside needs no aggression. The free self does not need to defeat others to exist. The self recognizes that discomfort is the entrance fee of freedom. Avoided discomfort compounds dependence. Accepted discomfort builds range. Range expands choice. Choice defines freedom. The self becomes intelligent about its own fear. Fear loses mystery. Mystery feeds control. Clarity dismantles it. Once named, fear negotiates. It no longer commands. The self that claims inner freedom stops outsourcing identity. Fashion, trends, ideology, applause lose authority. Authority consolidates within. Consolidated authority stabilizes direction. Freedom reshapes ambition. Ambition stops seeking domination. It seeks coherence. Coherent ambition builds contribution. Contribution dignifies effort. The self within a freedom is less reactive. Reaction is predictable. Predictable beings are controllable. Freedom introduces delay. Delay enables discernment. Discernment preserves autonomy. Inner freedom allows the self to stand apart without bitterness. Bitterness binds. Distance clarifies. Clarity strengthens presence. The self realizes that most manipulation relies on speed and emotion. Slowed response breaks manipulation. Freedom slows response deliberately. Deliberation protects choice. The free self becomes difficult to shame. Shame requires internalized judgment. Freedom replaces borrowed judgment with conscience. Conscience answers only to truth. The self that answers to truth does not fear temporary loss. Loss endured consciously does not dismantle identity. Identity anchored internally absorbs impact. Freedom deepens ethical clarity. When incentives disappear, ethics reveal themselves. What remains chosen, when reward is absent, defines the self. The free self carries fewer illusions. Illusions demand maintenance. Maintenance exhausts. Reality accepted. Requires less defense. Energy saved fuels action. The self within a freedom becomes accountable. Accountability replaces blame. Blame weakens agency. Agency creates dignity. Dignity confirms strength. Freedom also disciplines speech. Speech becomes precise. Excessive explanation fades. One no longer needs to justify existence. Presence becomes sufficient. The free self understands that dependence is cumulative. Small compromises accumulate. Freedom requires interruption. Interruption at first feels painful. Pain clarifies. Clarity liberates. The self learns that courage is sustained choice, not dramatic defiance. Daily refusals to lie. Daily agreements with truth. Daily alignment. These quiet acts construct sovereignty. Inner freedom matures emotion. Emotion no longer hijacks decision. Emotion informs without ruling. Information guides. Guided action compounds strength. The self within a freedom creates space around itself. Space allows thought. Thought prevents reflex. Reflex enslaves. Awareness liberates. The free self carries responsibility lightly. Because it was chosen. Chosen responsibility dignifies effort. Unchosen obligation corrodes it. The self becomes immune to false urgency. Urgency is a weapon. Freedom disarms it. Time returns to the self. Time reclaimed expands life. The free self moves through society without dissolving into it. Participation replaces absorption. Contribution replaces conformity. The self remains intact. While engaging fully, the self recognizes that freedom was never comfort. It was clarity. Clarity survives environments. Comfort rarely does. Inner freedom completes Khudi. The self stands authored. Not by reaction. Not by fear. Not by imitation. But by conscious alignment. With purpose and conscience. The self that attains inner freedom does not demand permission to exist. It acts responsibly. Responsibility validates freedom. Freedom no longer feels rebellious. It feels grounded, calm, decisive, quietly immovable. The self that becomes free internally cannot be enslaved externally. External forces may restrict movement. They cannot erase sovereignty. This is not invincibility. It is independence of conscience. Independence of conscience is the highest form of dignity. And so the self stands, no longer asking who it must obey, but knowing who it will become.